Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to do the second half of my May wrap up, discussing with you the rest of the books that I read in the month of May. Continuing on with my month's reading, I decided that I wanted to make more progress in my aim to reread all of my old favourites. This is a little project I'm doing, going back over books that in the past I have considered to be one of my favourite books of all time, so that eventually I will end up doing a proper top 10 list for you. But I want to make sure I'm being thorough. I want to make sure that each of the books on my top 10 truly deserve their place there, and to me the best way of doing that is to reread all of them in quite quick succession, so I can kind of check them off against each other. Okay, I really enjoyed this book at the time that I read it, but does it hold up next to this one? Most of the books that I do consider to be my favourite books of all time are ones that I've reread quite a lot, but there were at least 2 or 3 of them which I had only read the first time. And so I'm really questioning, was that book quite as good, or was it just the time and place that I read it worked very well for me? I just want to know. And so I ended up rereading 2 old favourites, the first of those being The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. You'll be no stranger to this book on my channel, and just generally to the booktube community at large. Madeline Miller's debut novel, her Greek myth retelling of the Trojan War, particularly through the eyes of Patroclus, detailing his childhood, his banishment which led to him being brought up in the same court as Achilles. In this particular retelling, Madeline Miller takes the debate that has raged for millennia at this point as to whether or not Achilles and Patroclus were in fact lovers, and she very much goes down the road of yes they were. I'm not going to talk about either of my rereads too much, but in terms of whether or not this held up, yeah, it did. I'm such a sap. I weep every time at the end of this book. And I feel like why this to me is my favourite Greek myth retelling, and why I think it stands head and shoulders over most of the other Greek myth retellings out there, is there's just so much care and consideration. This was, you know, not the first Greek myth retelling, but it was the one that really set the trend. And you can tell that time was actually taken over this book, over mapping out the story, thinking about the characters, rather than something that was rushed together to capitalise on a trend. You can really feel the care and consideration that Madeline Miller took in creating this story. I've seen people criticise the pacing of this book, saying that certain moments were too slow, which I personally didn't find. And I mean, especially when you get to the Trojan War sections, like, yeah, it's gonna feel slow. They're basically trapped outside a city for 10 years, with very little progress being made either side. Of course that's going to feel slow, that's just what's happening. But for me, I could think of very few circumstances where there were any words out of place. Everything felt very deliberate, alongside some of my favourite characterizations of these figures. On this reread, I was even finding that for the character of Odysseus, who is my favourite Greek myth hero. Yes, a problematic fave to be sure, but I've previously really disliked him when I've read this book, and actually I found a lot more nuance to his character than I found previously. Not a good person, not a hero by any means, but somebody who I understand a lot more, and how his characterization fits within the world that Madeline Miller has created. So not to spoil what I think is going to be on my top 10 list too much, but I would definitely say this holds up. The other favourite that I reread was The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This is one of the ones that I was the most anxious to reread, because I have only read this book the one time back in January, or was it February of 2020, when it had first come out, and it had such a profound impact on me when I read it. I absolutely fell in love with this book. Once again, it was my first retelling of a Jane Austen novel, kind of like how Song of Achilles was one of my first Greek myth retellings, and The Other Bennet Sister just kind of set the standard for me. This is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of Mary Bennet, growing up in the shadow of her much more beautiful, exuberant, vivacious sisters, constantly feeling like the odd one out, like the ugly duckling, just generally the unwanted middle child. The first third or so of the book retells the events of Pride and Prejudice from Mary's perspective, but then we follow a few years later, after Mr. Bennet has died, and Mary trying to find her own way in the world. Now she doesn't have the cushion, the support of her father, and the familiarity of her home at Longbourn. Her eventually finding her people who boost her confidence, who make her see herself in a different light, and help her to come out of her shell. And of course, it's a Jane Austen retelling. You wouldn't think there wouldn't be a little bit of romance in there. As I say, this really affected me when I was 24 reading it, as somebody who had always felt like the ugly duckling of my friendship group, as the plain one. But I was anxious that maybe it wouldn't hold up as well with the interim of 5 years, but no, this had quite the same effect. You know, while I have definitely grown up since I read this book, you know, like Mary, I now do not live with my family anymore. I'm in a different part of the country. I have different circles of friends. My confidence has been boosted by different changes to my circumstances. You know, being in a job that I love, doing extracurricular activities that I love, which includes YouTube, but also doing Musical Theatre Society, not being afraid to put myself out there. And I think now I'm appreciating Mary's journey through that lens of having gone through it. Whereas when I first read this book at age 24, I was kind of on the precipice of all of that. It's definitely a different reading experience, but one that I think has enriched my reading of The Other Bennet Sister. And once again, it is definitely a reread that has held up for me and gives me just as much joy as it did the first time round, if not even a little bit more. And now moving away from the rereads, for the books that I read for the first time for me, we have Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, which constitutes the penultimate book that I need to read in order to have read all of the novels of the Bronte sisters. I have The Professor still to read. So Shirley takes place in the 1810s in the north of England, with the backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars going on the continent, as well as the Luddite uprisings. A lot of industrial unrest in a town that very much depends upon industry for its economy. And we open with factory owners kind of dealing with this, discussing the issues that they are having with dealing with their workers, the hostility of their workers to new industry, bringing in machines that could potentially replace them. And then our focus ends up moving towards the actual main characters of this book, who are Caroline Helston, who is the main character that we follow, who is this quiet, pretty stifled and restricted girl. She is in love with one of these mill owners and is starting to really physically feel the toll of her life, the restrictions on her life, the fact that she is not married. People start to be concerned with her, and she ends up being introduced to the eponymous Shirley Kilda, who is a much more vivacious character, a wealthy heiress who is confident, opinionated, which of course for this time is seen as unconventional. When she is introduced into this book, around about 200 pages into it, it really upends everything, as Caroline is being introduced to a kind of personality that she's never seen before, especially in a woman. You've got these contrasting narratives between the two women, thinking about expectations for women of this time and happiness over propriety, at the same time as all of these hostilities and tensions arising with the mill owners and their workers. It is a really interesting book, and for me quite a sharp departure from something like Jane Eyre or Villette in terms of the kind of things it's dealing with. It's an interesting book. I can see why a lot of people like it, though it felt a little bit uneven for me. There are some of the best character descriptions that I have ever read in this book, and particularly the first chapter or so I thought was just some of the strongest writing from Charlotte Bronte. There's just some really excellent self-referential moments in here. It feels quite meta when she's talking about the story that she's going to tell. There's a lot of wit in here. I love the focus on the restorative, revitalizing effects of having good, solid female friendship. But then it's also mixed in with, for me, what felt like a lot of nothing. Philosophical debates over work, and the two love stories for our two lead women that I wasn't overly invested in. And if I was not very invested in it, that means a lot, because even the most meh bland book can be saved by a good love story. For me, this is one that I'm glad I read. Maybe it'll mean more to me on a reread, but for right now, yeah, this is definitely not pipping Jane Eyre to the post in terms of my favourite Bronte book. We then have The Ministry of Time by Kalliane Bradley. I'm sure so many of you have seen this book and read it yourselves. In this, we are seeing a future Britain in which time travel is possible, but it is being used in a very careful, constricted way, where we are extracting people from the past, but at the moment just before they're about to die, giving them the modern medical treatment that would allow them to survive, and then monitoring them to see how they fare in the modern world. What would be the ethics and implications of this, mentally, physically? And each of these figures are given a bridge, somebody who's going to be selected by the government to acclimatise them to the new world that they are entering. And our protagonist, who is actually unnamed, really hysterical how it took me until the end of the book to realise that they were unnamed, is one of these bridges, and she is assigned to the 19th century figure, who is actually based and named upon a real historical figure, Commander Graham Gore, a Victorian polar explorer who died as a result of exposure to the harsh conditions of the Arctic. In this, our narrator and Graham Gore are living together, getting him accustomed to the new world. You get themes in here of the culture clash between the two different time periods, and it makes us think what would be the ethical ramifications of doing something like this. Taking somebody not only from a place but from a time that they knew, and forcing them against their will, none of them consented to doing this, into being brought to a future time and being forced to assimilate. Our narrator is part Cambodian, and she and Graham are able to discuss from different perspectives the idea of colonialism, which, you know, for him as a Victorian man, he sees as a great thing. For her, she's able to give the perspective of, actually, no, it was not. And here are all of the negative things that we know are the result of colonialism. Both of them have dealt or are dealing with this feeling of displacement in different ways, and both of their perspectives rub off on each other and fundamentally change how the other sees their interaction with their societies that they've been brought up in. This is the only bridge and historical figure pairing that we really delve very deeply into. We get glimpses of the other characters and the various perspectives. I think there are 5 different time expats who are taken from 5 different centuries, and their experiences all vary wildly, as you would expect. But in terms of their relationship to their bridge, this is the one that is covered in the most detail. I can imagine a version of this story that would actually be a short story collection focusing on the bridge and expat relationship between each each of the different pairings, each story delving into the different things that they would discuss, different areas where they would clash or agree with each other. And I think that would be an interesting story, though obviously it would be very different to what we actually got. I would generally say I enjoyed most of this book. I think the conversations that it is having on these topics of colonialism and cultural displacement are really interesting, and I think this is a really fresh, different kind of perspective on that. The bits that I didn't enjoy so much from this, really it's the ending. It's when it becomes more of a mystery, more of a thriller, because, you know, we don't really get a clear answer on why it is that the government is doing this. What is the purpose? We can sense that something sinister is going on, but until the ending, we don't really get any answers to that. And then towards the end of the book, things do take a more sinister turn, and that's where the book kind of lost me. I don't know how else this book could have ended other than the plot just kind of exploding and everything going a little bit wild, but I didn't personally find that very satisfying. For me, the bits that are interesting are these conversations that these people from the past and the people from the present are having with each other, which would have necessitated this being a very different type of story than what was being told. But overall, really, really glad that I did read this one. And then the final book I have to show you today is A Poem for Every Spring Day, edited by Allie Esiri. And actually this collection gives you 2 poems per day. Either 2 that you can read all in one go, or you can read 1 in the morning, 1 at night, just to set you up for the day and give you a bit of spring inspiration. This year my goal is to work my way through the different seasonal poetry collections by Allie Esiri. And I've mentioned in a previous video that this book kind of cracked the code for me. I do find it really hard to do sustained like little bits of reading throughout the day. I just want to binge something in one go or not read it at all. But partway through reading this spring one, something cracked, and I found doing that little bit of poetry reading really enjoyable. And so I've ended the spring day book reading my 2 poems a day very gladly. As you see, I have dogged quite a few of these poems. I will say I found some repetitiveness in terms of the poets that she was including. There was a lot of Lewis Carroll in here, and as somebody who is not the biggest fan of Alice in Wonderland to begin with, I could have done without that. But there was a point in here around about April where you got 10 Lewis Carroll poems almost in a row, and that was just a little bit fatiguing. You know, spring is an abundant season for poetry. You've got all of the lovely romantic poets, you've got all the lovely nature poetry, and that is some of my favourite kind of poetry. This definitely delivered for me, and I am very eager to pick up the summer poems. So there we go, those are all of the books that I read in the month of May. Please do let me know about any books that you read and really enjoyed this month. Alternatively, let me know anything that you're keen to pick up in the month of June. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.